you, Caroline. Thank you for this, and Joe, for this invitation. This is my second time at the MacGill Summer School, and it was very nice to be here last year. Very nice to come back this year. It's an eye-opener for me in many ways. Before starting, just let me say I think educating citizens is very important, obviously. Educating anybody is very important. But it's also important to engage citizens. And I personally feel that it's the engagement in a citizens' assembly rather than the education in a citizens' assembly which is most important. And it's also most replicable. If we want to improve our citizenry, whatever it is, 3 million citizens, 4 million citizens, and improve how to make things better for them, we'll have to do more than dividing them into 100 citizen groups and educating them there. We have to engage them. We have to engage them widely and we have to engage them intensively, and that means we have to engage ourselves intensively and widely, and that is what I want to talk about today. I'll start by saying that I work in a place called the European University Institute in Florence, where we do postgraduate research in various disciplines, and shortly before I came here there was a seminar by a young Norwegian scholar about how countries have been coping over the years with the global crisis, with the global economy and globalization, and with Europeanization and so on. And he looked over a long term, so it's not just over one government or two governments, but over, say, a 10 or 20-year period. And he compared three small countries, 2 in Europe and 1 outside. He compared New Zealand, Norway and Ireland. And he interviewed ministers, he interviewed civil servants, policymakers, central bankers and so on. And I talked to him afterwards and asked him sort of what lessons he learned in terms of what had gone wrong in Ireland, because as vis-a-vis Norway, we don't have, obviously, Norway's oil, but leaving aside Norway's oil, Norway does better than we do, did better than we do, as does New Zealand. And why Ireland did so badly? He said he had no easy answer to that at all. But what he did say is that one short answer is that if Ireland had had Norway's ministers for finance, or if Ireland had had New Zealand's ministers for finance over the last 10 or 20 years, we wouldn't be in the problems we are in now. Now, that is fairly shaming for an Irish person to hear. Because if the ministers matter so much, or the poor quality of ministerial government matters so much, or you might say the civil servants matter, and we don't have good enough civil servants, as in Norway or New Zealand or other countries, then what went wrong with this? And why don't we have this government and this infrastructure, this political infrastructure, which can govern us better, which New Zealand has and which Norway has, which the Netherlands has, which Denmark has, which a number of countries have? Because in politics, we as citizens should have exactly what we want and what we need. So why haven't we built up a system of government which suits our needs and which can look after us well and which doesn't neglect us, which it has done up to now? Now, one answer is that we're a new country. And new countries take a long time to learn. If any of you remember reading Joel Lee's book, Ireland 1912 to whatever it was then, 1990, his long history, which was very damning of Ireland's economic and social performance, he talked about this a lot, as Ireland is a new country. And that is true. But as well as being a new country, Ireland is one of the most experienced of Europe's democracies. We've had democracy longer and in a more sustained fashion than almost any other country in Europe. Most other European countries democratized when we democratized, but many of them lost that democracy during the war because of occupation, because of fascism, because of communism, whatever reason. We, on the other hand, sustained for over 80 years, over 90 years, a thriving democracy. So we escaped all of the costs of these countries which lost their democracies, and we were one of the very few countries to keep having elections and to keep electing our own governments. Each time during the war, we had 2 elections during the war. Each time we returned Fianna Fáil. But we have one of the longest experiences of any country of government by the people. And in principle, then, we have a thriving democracy. We have 1 TD for every 12,000 or so citizens. And it takes about 8,000 citizens voting to form a quota. So we're the best represented voters in Europe. There's nobody who can touch us in that regard. We have the longest democracy and the best represented voters. So the question is, why did we have such bad governments? Not just now, not just under Fianna Fáil, but in the last 10 years, but also in the 1950s and in the 1980s. A lot of people here will remember how bad it was then. So if we've had bad governments, and we've had bad ministers, whose fault is it? The simple answer, it's our fault. We, the citizens, did this. And this is the legacy which we have. So the question is then, what did we do wrong? Or what should we do to right it? What can we do to right it? Or can we even right it at all? Is it an inevitable legacy which we're always going to be stuck with and which our children will be stuck with? Now, partly it probably is, because partly there is a very deep and long-term problem here, which has often been commented on and which has often been discussed, which would require for its remedy a completely new mindset and a new way of looking at politics and at the state. And it's not easy to change mindsets and ways of looking at the state. And the problem here, it's a familiar problem, and that is that we don't respect our state. We've never respected our state. We've never had a sense of belonging for our state. If anything, we viewed, and this has been commented on by numerous observers of history and politics now, if anything, we see the state as the enemy, as an oppressor, as something not to be trusted but to be taken advantage of. That's the culture of the cute whores, the strokes and so on and so forth. You get away with it. And getting away with it against the state is getting away with something which is not us and doesn't belong to us, but belongs or is somewhere out there and is not ours. And that's often a syndrome which you find in many newly independent countries, in many ex-colonial countries, which have never run their own state for very long, and therefore when they get their state, they still see it as something alien and something distant. For different reasons, the country I now live in, Italy, for different reasons you get the same sort of syndrome in Italy, where you are seen as having you are seen as having a great achievement if you can get one over on the state. And it's a culture, a hostility to the state, a lack of trust in the state, a lack of respect in the state, which in Italy has given us Silvio Berlusconi. But Silvio Berlusconi is probably only the worst in the long line of bad governments and bad Italian prime ministers. Now in Italy, it was an American sociologist who studied this phenomenon back in the 1950s. And he coined a term for this which is still used by sociologists in Italy. He called it amoral familism. Now what he means by that, or what he meant by that, is that if you look at the ordinary Italian, then the ordinary Italian will do anything he or she can possibly do to benefit his or her family. And you forget about everything else, even if it's at a cost to the state, and even if it's at a cost to the neighbours, or if it's at a cost to other Italians, it doesn't matter. The primary thing is to benefit your family, to advance your family, for your family to do well. He called it amoral familism. You're family-oriented, but you've no morality in anything else you do. Now, we have a bit of that in Ireland too, but what we have also with this electoral system of ours is something you might call amoral localism, which is that you do anything you can to benefit your locality and your constituency and your district, and your TD will do anything he can to benefit your locality and your district and your constituency, and in a sense damn everything else. Now that's something which will be very hard to change, but it brings me to the second symptom, and that's much more redeemable, at least to my mind, much more redeemable. Because partly because of that tradition of being hostile to the state and wanting to take advantage of the state, to see the state as something which you milk for your own benefit rather than something you sustain and contribute to. Because of that, but also because of our institutions, and because of our electoral system, and because of the way politicians and parties have run and organised political life, we've ended up suffering from the oldest cliché of all, which is that we've lost sight of the wood because we've been looking too much at the trees. We've been so busy as citizens in ensuring the representation of our own interests and those of our constituencies that we've lost sight of the broader collective interest. And we've lost sight of that a long time ago. We exert great control over our TDs. That is where all of our representation goes. We exert great control over our TDs. We've never sought to exert any control over our governments. And the result was a huge vacuum in terms of responsibility and in terms of authority, right at the centre of the stage of government. As citizens, we never held our governments accountable for their policies. We were too busy holding our TDs accountable for their local activities. And that had two clear consequences. The first is there was never any pressure from us as citizens, or from the backbenchers, the TDs, or often from the media, to oblige governments to act responsibly and with due care. Hence, it was very easy for our governments to be negligent of our interests, and we've always allowed them to do so. Now it's become a problem, but we've allowed them to do so for a long time. Secondly, because there was a vacuum at the centre of power, which we weren't filling as citizens, and which our TDs weren't filling as our representatives, other people stepped in and took over responsibility and took over control of the policy making. The special interests stepped in. The bankers stepped in. The builders stepped in. The church stepped in. The government, our TDs, we as citizens stepped out. And then when things were bad, which they did go bad, we could always then blame those special interests and blame the powerful lobbies for what went wrong. We could blame the property speculators for the boom that they fueled, and we can justly blame them. We could blame the bankers for the reckless lending they engaged in. We can blame Europe for tempting us with cheap money. All of that, indeed, we can blame easily. And for the destruction caused to the lives of countless children, and often to their mothers, we can blame the church. It's all their fault, the bankers, the church, the special interests, the builders, the lobbyists, whatever it might be. But all of this happened and was allowed to happen on our watch as citizens and under the auspices of our state, which we always neglected and never engaged with and never found a sense of belonging for. So there is indeed a failure of banks, of churches, of builders, of politicians and so on, but it's also state failure. And when there's state failure, it means there's our failure as well. And so despite years and decades of bad government on both sides, not just in the last 10 years, and of poor performance, and of mass emigration, and of all of the problems which we know and which, growing up in the west of Ireland like I do, we saw on a daily basis, we still stayed with the most moribund political system in Europe, and we stayed re-electing the same parties and the same politicians, and often members of the same families. Now, last year at the MacGill Summer School, I also talked about this. I think it's worth talking about again. Because when you look at Ireland in comparison, what you see is a stagnant politics. What you have seen for a long time is a very stagnant politics. No new political parties, no new political ideas, very low levels of electoral change for years and years and years, until finally, last March, soon after my last MacGill talk, the electorate finally rose up and expressed its discontent. And the dam seemed to break, finally, very volubly, indeed, as Micheál will know all too well, indeed, as Eamon will know all too well. But as for Fianna Fáil, for example, there is no single party. I've studied parties for a long time in Europe and elsewhere, but there is no single party anywhere in Europe that has ever taken such a battering at the polls as Fianna Fáil did last March. And the election was the most volatile election in post-war Europe, the third, so it's just not the most, but the third most volatile election in European post-war history, which is a big record. The most volatile election was that which led to Berlusconi's election in Italy in 1994. The second most volatile election was the one that led to the big populist revolt in Holland in 2002, when Pim Fortuyn got elected and then was succeeded by Geert Wilders. And the third most volatile election was Ireland in 2011. So what did this great revolution and this great earthquake lead to? What radical change did it usher in? Well, let's see. It led to the restoration to power of a party that at last enjoyed the status of the biggest party in the Dáil 80 years ago. It led to the foundation of a government that has been the time-honoured alternative to Fianna Fáil since the end of the 1960s. It was a revolution which dealt Fianna Fáil a hammer blow, but which otherwise ushered in absolutely nothing new in terms of politics, nothing different, and nothing other than what we have seen before after the defeats of Fianna Fáil, the major defeats of Fianna Fáil in 1948 and in 1973. Back in 1932, there was a commentator who talked about the advent of Fianna Fáil to office, which was a big change then in 1932. And he said, a guy called Arthur Cleary, and he was quoted as saying that it's not going to make much difference. It's only a change from government by Clongo's boys to government by Christian Brothers' boys. But now we don't even see that difference anymore. So what do we conclude from this? What we conclude from this is that the level of the parties at the top of the political system, at the level of the political elites, nothing much changes in Irish politics. We have a very conservative political elite and a very conservative elite political culture. And therefore, if anything is to change in Irish politics, it can only come from the bottom up and through pressure from the people at the bottom, up towards the system. Institutional change will certainly help that, but it won't be enough on its own. What we need, if we are to change Irish politics, is a new citizens' politics. Now let me step back a bit. I won't be long more, but let me step back a bit from this and look at this in a wider context, because we've obviously got very severe problems in Ireland, economically, socially, and politically. They're very severe, but they're not completely unique. In the scale, well, the scale in Greece is probably worse, in Portugal may be worse. But they're not completely unique problems which we face here. Across most of the established European democracies now, as well as in many of the new Eastern European democracies, there is evidence of increasing citizen discontent and dissatisfaction with political leaders, and evidence of a growing gap and a growing disconnect between citizens and the political class. This gap is now fueling a lot of, in Europe, you've read about this and seen it, a lot of populist protests on the left, but also and particularly on the right. That was the protest that led to Berlusconi in Italy, and then to Fortuyn and later Wilders in the Netherlands. It's led now very recently to the resurgence of the National Front in France. It's led to the rise of a new right-wing government in Hungary, with an associated, not part of the same party, but in a friendly party associated with it, a strong right-wing militia, which bears all the hallmarks of a fascist grouping. And it's led to right-wing parties in Denmark, in Sweden, and in Norway, and not just to right-wing parties, but also to fringe elements on the right, which we saw with such tragic consequences last weekend in Norway. But almost everywhere in Europe, no matter what the country is, politicians are believed to have lost touch with their roots and to have turned their backs on the wider society. Almost everywhere, politicians are now seen as being too busy with themselves to pay attention to the voters. At the same time, politics, and especially party politics, seems to have lost much of its purpose and much of its raison d'etre. Any government, any party in government, we don't have a governing party on the panel at the moment, but we have ex-governing parties who will know this all too well, that governing parties faced, Obama knows this at the moment all too well, that faced with a burden of, huge burden of national debt, and in the European case, faced with the constraints imposed by Europe on its policies, almost all governments have lost their room for manoeuvre. They're just been squeezed and squeezed and squeezed. And they've lost their capacity, much of their capacity, to steer their societies and to steer their economies. So for citizens looking at this, who might be troubled by the way economies are going or societies are going, and look at elections as a way of changing it, citizens will eventually find, and do eventually find, that it is much easier to change governments than it is to change policies. As one commentator put it, what we have now in contemporary Europe is a democracy without choices. The end result is always given, because the governments have no control over it. We can just change the people who implement it. So these are not easy times anywhere, in Ireland or anywhere else, in which to assert the need for a stronger voice for ordinary citizens. So if we do want that, which direction should we go in? Well, there are two ways, and I'll finish with this. There are two ways to look at what governments do. One is we can look at what they deliver, which is the product, which may be good or may be bad, whatever it might be, but it's what they deliver. And the other thing to do is look at how they deliver it, which is the process. Now, to me, in Ireland at the moment at least, there's not much point in emphasising the product. The product is out of the hands of any Irish government. It's in the hands of the Troika, it's in the hands of the EU, it's in the hands of the bankers and the financiers, it's in the hands of the markets and the rating agencies. It's not in Merrion Street or anywhere else. Jean Kerrigan, when he was commenting on the outcome, in a column commenting on the outcome of the election last March in The Independent, said, I don't know what all this speculation is about, who's going to form the new government. We all know who's going to form the new government. It's going to be a coalition of Fine Gael with the EU and the IMF. So you can't focus on the product, I think, because the product will be more or less given. What you do then is you focus on the process. And if you want a better democracy, you try and improve it procedurally rather than in terms of its output. And we do three things. We need to do three things, three very simple things there. We need to ensure more responsible and transparent decision-making. In other words, we don't want decisions behind locked doors at 3 in the morning, out of touch with the people. We want much more transparent, considered and responsible decision-making. We need to involve, that's the second thing, is we need to involve the citizens and their representatives, including the TDs, much more closely in the deliberative process, exactly the sort of deliberative process that David was talking about in We the Citizens' Assembly. We need to have more deliberation like that and more discussion like that, involving citizens but also involving TDs. And we as citizens need to become much more engaged, and for the first time we need to acquire a real sense of ownership of our state and over our state. Now that will require a change in mindsets, which will be difficult, and it will require a change in behaviour, which will be difficult. But perhaps in that sense the crisis can help. After all, why waste a good crisis if you have one? But it will be helped, and it could be helped by institutional change, and that's where David and I think, will find common cause. And there are at least, from my view, there are at least three things which should be done. And these things are small things, relatively easy things to do, but which, if you look across Europe, may be important things to do. The first is, and I'm more and more convinced of this, we need to reform our electoral system. What sort of electoral system we get instead is more open to question, but we need to get away from this multi-seat constituency competition, which ensures great representation of Irish voters, but also leads to amoral localism and disaggregates our voices. Michael D. Higgins once said that Irish politics disaggregates the poor. It doesn't just disaggregate the poor, it disaggregates everybody except the special interests. It encourages us to look at the trees and to forget about the forest. So we need to change that system. Secondly, we need to change the Dáil and engage in Dáil reform. We need to get an end to the quiescence and the deference of TDs to their governments. We need to end the quiescence and the deference of the Dáil to the government itself and to the executive. We need to end executive domination. We need much more dialogue and much more sharing of powers between the executive and the legislature. And the third thing we need to do, especially now that these issues have been raised with property taxes and new local taxes, is we need to reform local government. We need to give real power to local government. We need to properly resource local government. And we need to require and demand strong local engagement in local government and citizen engagement in local government. When you look around Europe, you see a pattern of relative, in terms of how strong democracy is, it is a relatively bleak and depressing picture. Citizens are very dissatisfied, citizens are very discontented, political leaders can do very little. But there is one country which is bucking the trend in a variety of ways. In other respects, that country is not so nice in what it does, but in some ways it's bucking the trend and showing what can be done. And that's a country which has promoting more citizen engagement, which is promoting more citizen satisfaction, and which is promoting a much stronger connection between citizens and their elites. And that is Denmark. And the way Denmark has done it, the first step which Denmark has done to do this, is it has reformed and bolstered and empowered municipal government. I think that would be a very important first step in Ireland too. That's where we can begin, as citizens, to engage in running our own state and taking back control over our own state. Thank you.